Join me as I take on the challenge of sharing my honest thoughts on trusting God's goodness from my perspective as a 12-year-old. Trusting in God's goodness is something that can be really hard to understand, especially when we're faced with tough situations in our everyday lives. I think it's something that we all struggle with at some point or another, and it's definitely something that I've struggled with myself. When you're young, it's easy to wonder why bad things happen to good people, or why God would let bad things happen in the first place. You start to question whether God is really good, or if He's just not paying attention. You might even wonder if God is really there at all. I know I've had those thoughts before, and it can be really scary to feel so unsure about something that's supposed to be so important. As you get older, you start to realize that life isn't always easy, and that bad things can happen to anyone, no matter how good they are. You might lose someone you love, or you might face a difficult situation at school or at home. When those things happen, it can be really hard to trust that God is good, or that He has a plan for your life. But even with all those doubts and fears, I've learned that trusting in God's goodness is one of the most important things we can do as Christians. It's not always easy, and it's not always something that we can see or feel right away, but it's something that can bring us peace and comfort, even in the toughest of times. One of my favorite Bible stories that always comes to mind when I think about trusting God's goodness is the story of Joseph. Joseph was a guy who had it really rough. His brothers sold him into slavery, and he ended up in prison for something he didn't do. But even in the midst of all that, Joseph chose to trust in God, and to believe that God had a plan for his life. And in the end, Joseph was rewarded in a huge way. He became one of the most powerful men in Egypt. I've also seen God's goodness in my own life, especially when my grandparents got in a car accident a few years ago. They were both really hurt, and it was a really scary time for my family. But even in the midst of all that fear and uncertainty, we chose to trust in God, and to believe that He was in control. And you know what? God came through in a huge way. My grandparents both recovered, and our family was able to grow even closer together. There was a time when I was really struggling with trusting God's goodness, and my mom sat me down and told me something that has really stuck with me. She said that trusting God doesn't mean that bad things won't happen. It means that even when they do, we can know that God is still good, and that He has a plan to use those things for our good. It was a really hard pill to swallow at first, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. I think that's one of the most important things we can learn about trusting God's goodness. It's not about avoiding the hard things in life, it's about trusting that God is good, even when they do happen. And when we can do that, it's amazing how much peace and comfort we can find, even in the toughest of times. So, I hope you guys can take away from this video that trusting in God's goodness is possible, even when it's hard. It's not always easy, but it's something that can bring us so much peace and comfort, and it's something that can help us to grow closer to God. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. If you have any stories about trusting God's goodness, please leave them in the comments below. I'd love to hear them. And if you're new here, consider subscribing for more videos on topics like this.